Claudelle, good day and welcome, and thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Obviously, the introduction provided a snippet of your life, your journey, and I'd like to start off by asking Claudelle to offer us, her time and explain her journey thus far in her own words.
Thank you for having me, Neil. It's a really an awesome experience, just going back into your own childhood, right, and reflecting back a little bit. My earliest memory that would be significant would be little Claudelle standing at the border of the school grounds. So this is the primary school. Diagonally opposite our school was the high school. And being confused by the commotion that was going on, because all these, what we would have referred to as the big kids, walking around with so they were protesting, there were Caspers, and the combination of confusion and a little bit of fear, and not understanding what is going on. And that was my first real, I suppose, introduction to the realities of South Africa, which is fundamental, and I start there, because you don't realize whilst you're growing up, when you're still a child, how the environment around you influences the way you see the world. Another element that I would say would have been fundamental in my childhood was my very, very first career choice. People get surprised when I say this, but little Claudelle's first career choice was to be a missionary.
Okay.
I don't even know today whether I completely understood the word, but there was a little bit of wanting to save the world.
Okay.
So if you bring those two together, a world in turmoil, and the sense of wanting to save the world, I did not have the wherewithal at that age to understand what was going on in my mind. But when you look back years later and you start to connect the dots, you can start to see how you were already shaped at that point in time. So fast forward, my first degree was in psychology. I majored in I had two majors. The primary major was psychology, clinical psychology, and I also majored in biblical studies and world religions. And that has really got to do with how I grew up in the interest from that perspective. So I thought I was going to become a psychologist. But then, at the end of the first degree, I then realized, hang on, wait a minute, my people don't go to psychologists. And white people are not going to come to me as a psychologist. How am I going to earn money out of this? So there was a pivoting that happened there. And essentially, to cut a long story short, my last degree, I looked at leadership, specifically looking at leading people through change and uncertainty. And then in terms of career-wise, ended up firstly in a church environment, right? So you can see the connection back to the missionary. I then realized actually you don't have to be in a church to save the world. There are many other ways, many avenues, many ways that you can skin the cat. And ended up with the Institute of Chartered Accountants. And I used to say to people, I work for the Institute of Chartered Accountants. I'm not a chartered accountant. I was then headhunted to join the Institute of Internal Auditors, started off as the COO. What they wanted to do was for me to take over from the CEO who was going to retire at the end of what would that have been 2009, so I took over in 2010. And I also used to say, I work for the Institute of Internal Auditors. I'm not an internal auditor. Post that, when I left the IIA South Africa, I went on a bit of a sabbatical because I'd been so busy. As an executive of a professional body, your time is literally sucked up all the time. I had no time to really reflect on what next. In that time, I did something that I always wanted to do, and that was I created a website. I wanted my place where I can go and dump my thoughts.
Okay.
And so Brave Inflections, the website, was born, and in the process, Brave Inflections, the practice was born.
Okay.
And the clarity of thought came through in the process. Yeah, so that's the journey in a nutshell.
Thank you very much for that summary. It's appreciated. And for me, what I'd like to hear from you is, in your view, the connection between your childhood, obviously the political realities that you grew up with, the socio-economic realities that you were faced with, and link it for us to your value system. How did that shape Claudelle von Eck and who Claudelle has become?
But I'd say, firstly, as I said earlier on, as a child, you are somewhat aware that something is wrong with the world, but you don't really understand. I was already at university level when I started to fully comprehend, hang on, I am in a country that does not value me because I'm a person of color, and even worse, I'm a female person of color. What that does is it gives you a understanding of how scenarios like that can destroy people on the inside. And I started to understand violence in a very different way, because when we talk about violence, we tend to only talk about physical violence, and we don't think about the violence that happens within, how we can destroy people within, and therefore empathy gets born in that, the realization of the importance of empathy. So empathy is something that's always been very core to my value system. And then there is, what you've been taught as a child, the respect for the individual. And for me, respect for the individual goes deeper than just greeting the person with respect or talking to the person in respectful tones. It is about understanding that every individual has a purpose. So when I look at an individual, and when I say I respect the individual because that individual has a purpose that is important to the collective. So for me, it's far deeper. If I disrespect you, I disrespect the collective. So respect, very, very important. And then just, responsibility, that's something that's been ingrained in me. And I always say that I blame my parents for an overdeveloped sense of responsibilities. I'm an eldest child. And my mother used to use the analogy of a snake. And she would always say to me, you're the eldest, you're the head of the snake. Whichever way you go, the little ones will follow you. So it's ingrained in me the understanding that I must always be aware of how my actions would impact on others around me. It doesn't mean that I always get it right? Because we're all human beings. But the combination of understanding the responsibility and the accountability that comes with it, understanding the role that you have in the greater collective, and understanding your purpose in relation to the purpose of others, and being responsible for your own motivation. So if I don't do what I'm supposed to do, I need to understand the ripple effects thereof. So I would say that those would have been the most important. That so bringing family together, but that is in the socioeconomic circumstances, and I can see it coming through now as well in terms of how I interact with others. That the reversal of the damage that the socioeconomic conditions and the political conditions have created in our people, that one works towards that. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. Thank you very much. So you experience the injustice, unlike people who are relatively young, who heard about apartheid. You experience it. You highlighted the incident where you were inside your house and you could hear the commotion outside. And what I'd like to know is that transition after university, and when you, for example, spend close to a decade at the Institute for Internal Auditors, and you're being credited for turning it around, putting processes and systems in place, and I must commend you for that. And what I'd like to specifically talk about is the challenges that you encountered, certainly as a female, as a woman that is black, so-called person of color. Share with us what was it like, and more importantly, how did you deal with it?
Sure. So I think for me, some of the challenges weren't necessarily obvious to me right at the beginning. And here I would credit my parents, and in particular my dad as well. Having been raised to see myself as an equal, and not understanding that you are necessarily being seen through a different lens, and that your actions are being read through that lens. So one of the biggest challenges for me was having to deal with different interests, and those interests being advanced by people who look at you through that particular lens. And realizing that people would question your ability. I think about a good example now that immediately comes to mind. Walking into a meeting with 2 or 3 of my managers, and I'm the non-white person in the story, right? And so you're meeting with others, and you can see how the conversation goes in terms of who people are looking to, who they're making eye contact with. And you can already very quickly see at the beginning, these people think I'm the junior in the story, right? And I'm supposed to be the CEO in the story. The way I dealt with it, and if I, now that I'm an older version of myself and look back, would I have done it differently? Probably not. The first point of call for me was to not take it personally. Right? So to be able to remove myself from somebody else's bias. That's your bias, it's not mine. It's your problem, it's not my problem. Right? Because I think sometimes what we tend to do is we absorb what the other does to us. And then if you absorb it, that's it. So the first is don't absorb. The second was it actually worked to my advantage. Because when people think that you are junior and that you are not seeing, that you're not observing, it actually puts you on a very, very good footing, right? So then at the end of the meeting, then when I decide I'm now ready to speak, then I would come in and here's the decision, boom, and you've caught people off guard. So it worked very, very well for me from that perspective. But as I said, the most important was how much of that do you internalize, right? The other challenge that I had also in terms of interest, when you're sitting in a professional body, it is inevitable that there will be people who use that context for their own glory. So they're not there to serve the profession necessarily, they're there to build their own status and build their own career. And that can be very, very difficult to deal with, especially when they are trying to push you to serve their interest instead of serving the interest of the profession. And that's where personally, if I look back, I would say that's probably been the biggest challenge for me, because that's where I would have gotten most of the pushback. The way I dealt with it, if I look back today, would I have changed something? Yes. In that context, yes. I think what I was not very mindful of was exactly that, the interest. And so I have a tendency of thinking that because I have an overdeveloped sense of responsibility that everybody else does, and then miscalculating in terms of the kind of pushback that you will get, not because what you want to do is wrong, but because it goes against the grain of those interests that are there. So I should have been more mindful of people's emotions and people's interest, and put measures in place to navigate around that. Would it have changed my decisions? Absolutely no. And I think when you know you're doing the right thing, you must stand on principle. But standing on principle without calculating how people can derail what you're trying to do because you're going against the grain of their interests, that's not a very wise thing to do.
Cool. So we're both professional coaches. We mentor people. And we're the fortunate ones that are credentialed in an era where so many people just go into coaching as an easy way out. And for me, one of the key things in my practice that I've come to realize over the 30 years of working is, in my view, how important self-acceptance is to individuals.
Yeah.
And I want to specifically, myself being a working class child from a rural area and was raised by 3 working class women, what is your message to working class children in a society where the material things are almost so in your face? And it's as if sometimes some parents equate their responsibility to providing the material things, and it then results in those who don't have access to buy the Nikes, to send the kids to certain schools, create a platform that make it easier for kids who don't have the material things to feel less accepted.
Yeah.
What would your practical, drawing from your experience, and you highlighted, and it's very clear that your parents played a pivotal role in shaping you and who you are.
Yeah. Neil, you're touching on a very, very important point and very fundamental for the South African society. I was talking to somebody the other day and just reflecting and saying that I grew up in the midst of apartheid. But when I compare myself to today's young generation, I count myself as fortunate because we did not have to deal with exactly what you're describing now. We got used to our parents saying, there is no money, or do you think there's money growing on my back? And most of the time you wouldn't even ask for something because you knew what the answer was going to be. But it was okay because everybody else was in the same boat. All your friends, all your cousins, everybody was in the same boat. So you did not feel disenfranchised. Today, you have this stark contrast. And you have very vulnerable little souls growing up in this environment. And quite frankly, we have created a world that has become far more materialistic. How do you say to a young person, don't desire the material things, desire to become the best version of you. And when you are the best version of you, the material things will follow. Do the right things for the right reasons, and the money would follow. And I think they have an added challenge that we didn't have when we grew up, and that is everything is instant now. We had a better sense of time. We had a better sense of patience. Coming out of matric, there was nowhere in my head any notion of I'm going to jump into a managerial position as soon as I've completed my degree. You knew that there was going to be a journey. But it was the whole environment that aided you in your thought process, as opposed to you coming to those conclusions to yourself. So the way that I would approach, and this is what I do with my younger family members and extended friends, it is to show them the longer term effects, right? So you've got to be able to calculate. But I acknowledge, and I think our generation we've got to acknowledge that it's far more difficult for them than it is for us. They're being bombarded with stuff that we weren't bombarded with. I mean, television. We used to go to my grandma's to go and watch my dad's favorite program once a week. Mm-hmm. Right? So you didn't have that blasted in your face all the time. So it's far more difficult. So it's walking with that individual and constantly having that counter voice. I don't think it's just a once-off conversation because you're fighting against everything else. I feel for them. They have my empathy. Mm-hmm. I'm glad I was born when I was.
No, I'm also, I must say you about the television story, you take me back to Craddock, when I love rugby since a little 5-year-old, and I remember we didn't have a TV, we had to sometimes pay 2 cents or 5 cents to go watch Knight Rider,
yes,
and the All Blacks and the Springboks, and at the time I was an All Black, obviously I'm no longer All Black. But for me, you founded Brain Inflections in 2019. 2020.
Yes.
And what was very interesting, the world experienced a health crisis.
Yes.
We all describe it as COVID.
I registered my company a month before we went into a hard lockdown.
So take us through, it must have been difficult and more, you see what I hope, my vision with the program is to make it normal for people to say, but we have challenges. We had to sell our houses so that we don't feel this need to posture and to create a cosmetic reality. How did you handle it?
Neil, I was surprised at how well I actually handled it. I think part of it was I very quickly realized 2 things. The one is the universe gave me time to build. Because whilst we were in lockdown, I didn't have to go and hunt. So I had more time to think things through properly, to think about what exactly is this offering of yours. I had time to develop things. And I had time to develop me. Mm-hmm. And so I enrolled in a UCT course, so I did that. And it was, I think what helped me was not to go into a negative state. Mm-hmm. Right? Because if you go into panic state, when you're in a fear mode, anxiety mode, it becomes far more difficult to see the opportunities around you and to see the positives. The other was that it gave me a little bit of time to compose myself behind the scenes without having to do the stumbling, because that stumbling at the beginning is there inevitably. Mm-hmm. You don't know lots of things. How much do people charge for these things? Yeah, so how do I cost things? All of that I didn't have to do in the glaring eye. Mm-hmm. So for me, I was fortunate, but the most important lesson I think was being able to rest in this is where you are. This is the hand that you've been dealt with now, and being okay with it, and being okay with the universe got you. You know, you're gonna be okay. Right, so I thought if you asked me the question pre-COVID, how I thought I would have dealt with it, I probably would have said to you, I wouldn't handle it well. Mm-hmm. Because I need to feel a sense of control. I need to see I don't like uncertainty. And then I was thrown into the most uncertain of circumstances in my entire life. And I had a wonderful time.
Great. And talk to us about mental health and why it's so important. Whilst there's certainly I find as a former HR executive, people are much more comfortable to come up out in the open and talk about it and share the realities. I mean, most of us will have a family member that has been diagnosed with depression or any of the other clinical conditions. But what I'd like to just hear from accomplished people like yourself, the perception out there is, wow, Claudelle's got it all working out well. She's running her own company. Life is good, and we all know that's not the case. We have down days where we feel so down. How do you handle disappointments and your mental health generally?
So one of the things that I learned during that period, that we just talked about now, was that it actually is wonderful for me to ensure that I have my meditation time. Because I had time, right? I could get up in the morning, I could go into meditation for 30 minutes, and then I would do my yoga, and then my day would start and I would work on stuff. And I saw the benefit of that. Right? So the meditation, yoga, and then I've got my dancing as well. That's fundamental. As a matter of fact, the yoga started because I needed a replacement for the dancing whilst we were in lockdown.
Okay.
The physical activity, the activities that help you to de-stress, very important. Meditation, absolutely important, and that helps me to stay grounded because, why it is even more important for me now than ever before, something that is not spoken about, which is not a problem that you guys have, it's a problem that we women have, the joys of being the ones being given the task to carry the babies, is that we get to a point where we go into menopause. So generally speaking, when we talk about menopause, we only talk about hot flashes. Me, growing up, that's all I knew. I knew there was a thing called menopause. I knew that it happens to women at an older age. I knew it was going to happen to other women, not to me. Of course, why would I go through that? And I knew that there's hot flushes associated with it. What I didn't know was that for women, 3 hormones drop. Your estrogen drops, which most people are aware of, your progesterone drops, and your testosterone drops. And as a result of that, there is a myriad of symptoms. When I spoke to my mum and her sister about it, I said, you people, I'm never going to trust you ever again because you didn't tell me about these things. My mum laughed when I read the symptoms. They just thought it was old age, right? Because they didn't have the access to the information that we have now. Now, one of the things that I'm coming to the mental health issue is anxiety. Is one of the symptoms of menopause, which most people are not aware of, because your testosterone has dropped, right? So your barrier that you used to have, the protection barrier that you used to have, is no longer there. So for the first time in my life, when I got to the end of 2019, I felt like I was sitting in front of my GP, and I said to her, you need to give me something to calm me down, which freaked the living daylights out of me because I'm one of the strongest women I know. I'm like, I don't do this. I don't do panicking stuff, right? And later on then realized what was actually happening. The hormones have shifted and that barrier of protection that I had was no longer there. So having to deal with the anxiety and understanding that this is now part of my reality is why I am now very religious about I have to go into my meditation. I've got to do my breathing exercises. I've got to do my yoga. I've got to do my dancing. It helps me to stay composed and centered. More importantly, it is understanding that you've got to deal with what you have to face with, right? What you've got to face, right? So sometimes what we tend to do as human beings is we go into denialism, right? And what we want to project to the outside world, we want to project inwardly to ourselves as well, right? And sometimes we need to be honest with ourselves. I am now feeling anxious. If I need help, I need to ask for help. And not be afraid to ask for help, right? And the younger generation, I must say, I feel this is another area where I really feel sorry for them, because we see far more anxiety in that generation, and it's because of the world they've grown up in.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, something very close to, I think, would be even to yourself is how coaches, how mentors shaped our lives.
Yeah.
And some of them may not have the COMENSA title or ICF title, but were people who came into our lives at a particular point in time and had a profound impact on the way we see the world, the way we think. Do you mind sharing a couple of mentors and their contribution to your life?
Yeah. You know, funny, Neil, in the earlier part of my career, I did not have one single mentor or anybody that I can pull out and say mentor, besides, of course, in your family setting, your parents as you grew up. But what I'd come to realize was that for me, what works for me is to pull from different people. And different people would give me different things that would fulfill different needs in my life. The first one where I can say there was a real one-on-one relationship where there's been a very, very profound impact for me was, at the time he was a lecturer at Gibbs. And in conversation with him, it was the first time that the penny dropped for me that I was still in motion trying to catch up. So let me explain. So I grew up in the township in Pretoria called Eastrist. I went to school in the township up until standard 7. Sorry, I still talk about standards.
That's cool. I have the same problem. I need to
like, what is that in grades again?
No, it's not sub A, it's actually grade 1.
Exactly. So, but my last 3 years of schooling, I was at the German school. When I was still in the township, up until standard 7, I was always the top student in my standard, right? And I didn't have to work hard. Then I get to the German school, and suddenly I drop from being top student to struggling somewhere in the middle. And that was a real blow to my psyche. Because now I'm working, and I'm working hard, and I'm still struggling in the middle. And that's when it dawned on me for the first time what the education system had done to me, that I was behind. And you first, as a very young, vulnerable person, your first reaction is you're now amongst the white kids, and you've been told that they're smarter, and they are, because they're doing better, right? Nobody's told you, actually, they've had an advantage. You have been held back. And then the catching up starts, right? And so by the time I'm sitting in my late 30s at the time, so I'm already in my late 30s, sitting with this guy, and a white man, and he says to me in some of our conversations, stop trying to catch up. You caught up a long time ago. That was a...
Wow.
I didn't realize what I was doing, right? And this is the beauty of coaching, right? It's coaches help you to see things that you won't see yourself, because you're living in your own chaos. The second one that was a fundamental encounter was a Israeli woman. Her name is Anat. And Neil, she gives me homework the one day, and she says to me, I want you to go make a list of everything you like about yourself and everything you don't like about yourself. I think, it's easy homework. Right? I'm very self-aware, right? So do my homework, very proud of myself. Go and see her the next time, put my homework in front of her, and This woman looks at my list, and at some point she does this. She's starting to shake her head. I'm like, I cannot be failing a test on myself. I was like, how do you fail a test on yourself? That's not possible. And she asked me this question. On the list, and this blew me away because I didn't expect this question, right? Why are we even having this conversation? So she asked me, on the list of things where you say that what you like about yourself, why don't I see on that list that you are beautiful? I'm like, what kind of a question is that? What manner of nonsense is this, right? And I was like, because I'm not. And she pushes me, and I'm not understanding why this woman is pushing me on this, right? And I'm growing up, I never thought of myself as beautiful. I look in the mirror. I don't think of myself as ugly. I thought I was average. I don't think of my beauty was not a thing for me. And I left that day still not understanding why we're even having this conversation, because it was never important to me. My brain has always been far more important to me than my looks. And about a week or two weeks later, my cousin was visiting. At the time, he was living in Colombia, and a friend of mine and the two of us took him out to a couple of places, sightseeing, went to the Apartheid Museum. At that time, I hadn't been to the Apartheid Museum, and I've been in avoidance mode so I went in, and I wasn't even in for I couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. I then stopped and I said, guys, I'm going out, it's too much. It was too much. The emotion was just too much. You'll find me outside. And I'm sitting outside, and in hindsight, I now realize I needed that to happen to understand where she was going. Right, so I'm sitting outside by myself, and I'm looking at the ground. I remember there was a small little rock. I was looking at this little rock, and boom, it hits me. You don't think you're beautiful because you grew up in apartheid South Africa. And the next thought, I'm damaged. That was fundamental for me. Now I'm sitting in my 40s. I'm already in my 40s, and for the first time in my life, I realize I am damaged. So I had always thought that I was disenfranchised. You know, we were disadvantaged. But I was thinking about it in those terms. Things were being withheld from me. I was not able to advance as fast as I would have if I'd been a white man. I never thought about what happened inside of me. And that day, the penny dropped, and then I understood where she was going. And then the work had to start. Then I had to start working on me, on the inside. So those are the two most fundamental ones that immediately jumps to memory, where sitting with a coach has helped me to shift significantly. And you can see in both cases it connects back to what South Africa has shaped us into.
Okay.
Yeah.
And certainly you are beautiful. You don't need to worry about that, both inside and out.
I've come to terms with it. I'm joking.
So we're coming towards the end, and to me, my penultimate question would be, you serve as a board member.
Yeah.
You serve as a board member for years and fairly large entities. And it's important that we help people to understand why we have boards. And if you want to join a board, that you understand why you need to come with a certain set of mindset, knowledge and skills. So if you appointed typically, and an organization say, Claudelle, bring us the short list of 10 people who should serve on our board, what will Claudelle look for?
Yeah. Neil, that's a very, very good question. And one of the things that worry me these days is that we have too many people who think that sitting on a board is a glory thing and it's an easy thing. So fundamentally, boards are there to oversee from a governance perspective the organization, and it's a huge responsibility. Now, why it is fundamental to understand that it is a huge responsibility is that, say, if you look at the King report, we're now talking about organizations being corporate citizens. So your ability to understand that an organization has an impact on society, has an impact on the economy. Its actions have ripple effects, and significant ripple effects on the broader society. Even if you were just to look through a narrow lens in terms of how it treats its employees, it has an impact on society. So you're actually presiding over a corporate citizen, and whether when you're not making the right decisions, you can have an impact on society that is not just now, that can have long-term consequences for a broader society. So that responsibility is huge, right? And it's absolutely important that we understand that. Now, when you think you can just jump into a position like that based on your book knowledge, you run a significant risk both for the organization and for yourself. Right? So for the organization, that you won't have the degree of insight, the depth of the gravitas that comes with those levels of decision making and understanding the risks and the ripple effects thereof. So you can break the organization and have a significant, severe impact on society, as I said, but also on yourself, right? I've also seen people who end up in serious trouble because they were not ready for that role as a board member. Right, so what would Claudelle look for in a board member? First of all, maturity, right? And maturity of your ability to carry yourself in a manner where you understand your fiduciary duty. You understand that your decisions that you've got to make needs to be in the interest of the organization and the broad stakeholdership, and not you, right? So, and that's important, right? So often you see people throw tantrums and do things that are in their own interest on boards, and that's a maturity issue. The other, of course, is whether you've got, for me, there's got to be two pillars when you talk about competence, right? So the one is your theoretical knowledge, of course. I mean, that's what you get through studying your degrees and so forth. The other is your practical experience, right? So your ability to say, see, Neil, this scar here, in 2006, this is what happened. So you have gone through the growing up phases. You've gone through the pain of what happens when decisions are made in a certain way, so that you can steer in the right direction. But also when the organization goes through turbulence, that you can hold a cool head. And so part of the board's responsibility, of course, is also to, especially when the organization is going through crisis, being able to help the executive to get into the eye of the storm. But if you don't yet have a strong handle on yourself, how are you going to do it for others? So I think that is important. And today it's what we've mentioned in people wanting to jump too fast, not going through the growing phases. So it's like putting a kid who's in kindergarten in charge of lecturing to university students. I mean, if I can use that as an analogy. But we also have too often where we have gatekeepers who, I want to bring my people in without taking into consideration whether it's the right fit for the organization.
And people who think like us and who's not going to rock the boat and will keep things the same.
No, absolutely.
And to me, I would like your view on, there's an emphasis, yes, it's great to understand the industry.
Yeah.
It's great, you must understand value chain of organizations so that you're able to add value. But I like your comment on why characters are so important.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
if you look at whether it's Enron or whether it's Steinhoff,
Yeah, yeah.
I know hindsight is a perfect science where we afterwards will have ideas of what people should have done.
Yeah.
But it's so obvious that people just lack courage.
Yes.
And if you talk about, in your experience, how important is it that sometimes I am not a CA. So there are technical parts of the CA, of the CFO report that I will not understand. But having that courage to say, can you just explain why did you create a provision?
Yeah.
Because sometimes in that moment where you keep quiet is where you're actually compromising your fiduciary duty.
Yeah.
Your comment.
Yeah. No, I fully agree with you. You cannot be in the seat of a director if you don't have the courage. So it's the courage to ask the questions that may look like to you like you're asking a stupid question, because we don't want to be embarrassed in front of others. We don't want others to think that we don't know what we should know. You have to have the courage to be able to call management out. You've got to have the courage to call your own fellow board members out, and that's sometimes really, really, really difficult. Right? So that accountability issue can be very, very difficult. You've got to be able to have the courage when you see interest play out, to be able to stand on principle, and that's where we actually really get tested, right? When you've got to stand and really stand on principle and do the right things for the right reasons. But no, you can't sit in a directorship without having the courage. That is really fundamentally important. And part of it, I think, Neil, is also why sometimes board members trip over themselves, is because they don't prepare themselves well enough. You know, there's still stories abounding of people opening packs in the meeting. Right? And you then lose the respect of the executives because they have spent an enormous amount of time to put the pack together, and if you haven't taken the time to read the pack and you ask stupid questions because the answer is in the pack. And once that starts to happen, you then start to create toxicity between the board and the executive very, very easily. Yeah, so courage all around is very important.
Cool. So I want to conclude with statements and questions that essentially focus on two issues. The first one is there's a lot of negativity in the country. Our economy is growing at a pedestrian pace. Our interest rates probably at its highest. Our unemployment rate is very high. There's a lot of bad vibe, if I may use the word. And what I don't apologize for is I'm a South African, I want this country to work. And the chances are 1% that I will go somewhere else. Yeah. Although there are opportunities for people like you and myself to possibly go somewhere else. So my question is twofold. One is, how do you make sure you stay positive amidst all this negativity?
Yeah.
And tell the viewers what is next for someone that is so accomplished. You have your doctorate that you completed at UJ, you serve on boards, you've already made a significant impact. What is next for you?
That's a big question. Let me start with the first one. How do I stay positive? I'm like you. I love this country. I believe in this country. I really believe, honestly believe in South Africans. Do we have problems? Absolutely. Do other countries have problems? Absolutely, yes. And the advantage of having worked in international circles and, you know, having encountered people outside of South Africa and being able to measure is that one can come to the conclusion very quickly that the grass is not greener on the other side, right? But that this country, because of its particular history, the fact that it's so diverse, the fact that it's such a melting pot, it has something special. And that I keep focus on that. I very, very deliberately minimize my intake of the news. So I sift and I very, very deliberately ensure that I don't focus on the negative stuff. Right? And that's sometimes hard for us as human beings because our brains are wired to deal with threats, right? So you would look at the negative first. But it is about self-regulation. Mm-hmm. And so the way I look at it is that if I allow myself to get sucked into all the negativity, I'll put myself in a state of anxiety. If I'm in a state of anxiety, I pull away the energy from my prefrontal cortex. If I pull away the energy from my prefrontal cortex, I cannot problem solve. Mm-hmm. And in the role that I find myself in, the roles that I play, I need to be in my prefrontal cortex. So I've got to manage that very, 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 very carefully. This country has been through far worse than it's going through now, right? So, and we've overcome. We're solid people, and I really believe that we can take this country to higher heights for sure. In terms of what is next for me, that's a very interesting question, right? So I've come to the conclusion in my life that where we are in the world today, planning way in advance is not always a very, very wise thing to do. And it's far more, I would say, in tune with my nature to work on a continual self-improvement and working with this understanding that the universe knows which doors will open at what period of time. When the door opens, I must make sure that I'm ready to go through that door. From a Brave Inflections perspective, I can see the internationalization that is starting to take place. So I'm starting to get more clients, and to tie it back to the first question that you asked, and the positivity about South Africa, is that I really strongly believe that we have a lot here in this country that we can teach the world. So what I would like to see next for me is that Brave Inflections becomes a conduit of taking learnings from South Africa to the rest of the world.
Fantastic. And thank you very much for your time. You're a busy person, you coach, you attend board meetings. There's obviously the family and personal responsibility. Yeah. It's really been an honor.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed it. And for those of you watching, thank you very much for watching. That was our conversation, mentoring conversation with Dr. Claudelle von Eck. I know she told me I am Claudelle. I don't like the doctor title. But by the way, no, I'm really proud of you. I wish you all the best. I wish you health, an abundance of health, and abundance of contentment, because I think ultimately our journey is unpredictable, and we must. I don't like happiness. I prefer joy, because joy to me represents that internal set of satisfaction. So thank you very much. And for those of you watching, thank you very much. You can go to www.abundancetalenthub.com to watch more of our videos. And we're looking forward to get in contact with you and to engage with you. Thank you very much.